In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where maple trees lined the streets and children's laughter usually filled the air, lived a remarkable 6-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word since birth. His bright brown eyes and gentle smile touched everyone who met him, making up for the words he couldn't say. His parents had hired many nannies over the years, but none stayed long enough to truly understand their son's unique way of communicating. That changed the day Mrs. Chen walked through their door. At 62, she carried decades of experience caring for children, though she'd never worked with a nonverbal child before. Her silver-streaked hair was always neatly tied back, and her warm presence immediately filled any room she entered. Something about her patient demeanor and kind eyes made the boy feel instantly at ease. During her first week, Mrs. Chen noticed how the boy would watch everything with incredible attention, taking in details that others might miss. He had developed his own sign language, different from standard ASL, consisting of unique gestures that only his parents partially understood. Mrs. Chen decided to learn his language, spending hours each day observing and noting down each movement, each expression. The boy's parents worked long hours at the local hospital, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. Mrs. Chen became not just a nanny but a constant companion, someone who took the time to truly see the world through the child's eyes. She learned that he loved drawing detailed pictures of everything he saw, creating entire stories through his artwork. One particularly warm autumn afternoon, while they sat in the backyard watching leaves dance in the wind, Mrs. Chen noticed something different about the boy's behavior. His usual calm demeanor had shifted to an anxious state, his eyes darting frequently toward the neighbor's house. At first, she thought he might be watching their cat, which often wandered into their yard, but this felt different. As the days passed, his drawings began to change too. Instead of his usual colorful scenes of nature and family, he started drawing darker images with heavy black crayon strokes. Mrs. Chen had worked with enough children to know that sudden changes in behavior or expression often meant something significant was troubling them. She spent more time watching the boy watch the neighbor's house, trying to understand what had captured his attention so intensely. The neighbors seemed ordinary enough, a middle-aged couple who always waved hello and kept their property well maintained. But Mrs. Chen had learned to trust her young charge's instincts. His inability to speak had heightened his other senses in remarkable ways. One Tuesday afternoon, while they were working on a puzzle together in the living room, the boy suddenly grabbed Mrs. Chen's hand. His movements were urgent, his eyes wide with concern as he began making a series of rapid gestures she'd never seen before. She leaned in closer, watching intently as he repeated the sequence, his small hands shaking slightly with the effort to communicate something clearly important to him. Mrs. Chen felt her heart rate quicken as she began to piece together what the boy was trying to tell her. After weeks of learning his unique language, she could now understand most of his communications, but this was different. This wasn't about wanting a snack or needing help with his shoes. The urgency in his gestures and the fear in his eyes told her this was something far more serious. Mrs. Chen sat down with the boy at his small drawing table, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper and some colored pencils. She had learned that when words failed, drawing often helped him express his thoughts more clearly. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he picked up a pencil, but his strokes were deliberate and focused. First, he drew the neighbor's house, then added something that made Mrs. Chen's blood run cold, dark figures moving in and out during late hours, carrying large boxes. He drew these scenes with such precise detail that she knew they couldn't be mere products of his imagination. Next to the figures, he drew a calendar with specific dates circled, showing that this had been happening regularly over the past few weeks. The boy then drew something else that caught Mrs. Chen's attention, a small window at the back of the neighbor's house, one that was partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Through the window, he sketched what appeared to be stacks of electronic equipment and multiple computer screens glowing in the dark. Mrs. Chen remembered how the neighbors had always kept their curtains tightly drawn, even during the brightest summer days. As she studied the drawings, memories of recent neighborhood events started connecting like puzzle pieces in her mind. The increased late-night activity, the unmarked vans that occasionally parked down the street, and the way the neighbors had recently installed extra security cameras around their property, details that seemed innocent on their own but now painted a more troubling picture. The boy wasn't finished. He pulled out another piece of paper and drew something that made Mrs. Chen gasp quietly. It was a detailed sketch of what he'd seen through that hidden window, stacks of credit cards spread across a table, and what looked like machines she'd seen at store checkouts. Living in the digital age, Mrs. Chen had read enough news articles to recognize the signs of potential credit card fraud. What impressed and concerned her most was how the boy had managed to piece all this information together. Unable to speak, he had become an incredibly observant witness. His daily routine of sitting quietly in the backyard, seemingly playing with his toys, had given him a perfect observation post of the suspicious activities next door. Mrs. Chen faced a difficult decision. She couldn't ignore what the boy had shown her, but she also needed to be certain. False accusations could have serious consequences. She spent the next hour asking him careful questions, using their shared system of gestures and drawings to confirm every detail. The boy's responses were consistent and clear, showing no signs of confusion or imagination at play. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the boy's drawing table, Mrs. Chen realized they had compiled quite a collection of evidence. The boy had even noted specific times and patterns of activity, drawing simple clocks to show when the suspicious visitors would arrive and depart. His attention to detail was remarkable, and his drawings told a story that words might have struggled to convey. Looking into the boy's worried eyes, Mrs. Chen understood that he had been carrying this burden alone for weeks, watching and waiting for someone to understand his message. She reached out and squeezed his small hand gently, letting him know that he had done the right thing by showing her. The relief on his face was immediate and touching. Finally, someone had understood what he had been trying so desperately to communicate. Mrs. Chen knew she needed to act carefully with this information. As she prepared the boy's afternoon snack of apple slices and peanut butter, her mind raced through various scenarios. She had worked in the neighborhood long enough to know Officer Kumar, the friendly police officer who often patrolled their street. He had a gentle way about him and had always stopped to wave at the boy during his rounds. While the boy ate his snack, Mrs. Chen casually moved to the kitchen window that offered a clear view of the street. She noticed something that made her pause. Two unfamiliar men carrying laptop bags were entering the neighbor's house through the side door, an unusual sight for this time of day. The boy, sensing her tension, quickly joined her at the window. His small hand grabbed her sleeve, and he nodded vigorously, confirming these were the kind of visitors he'd been trying to tell her about. Just then, Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed, a text from the boy's parents saying they'd be working late again due to an emergency at the hospital. This actually worked in their favor, giving her more time to handle the situation carefully. She didn't want to cause unnecessary panic, but she also knew that waiting too long could mean losing valuable evidence. The boy tugged at her sleeve again, this time pointing to his latest drawing. He had sketched what looked like a calendar, showing that these mysterious visitors usually stayed for exactly 2 hours. Mrs. Chen checked the time, 3:45 p.m. If the pattern held true, they would be leaving around 5:45 p.m., probably with more suspicious materials. Making her decision, Mrs. Chen sat down with the boy and used their special signs to explain her plan. She would contact Officer Kumar, but they needed to be very careful not to alert the neighbors. The boy's eyes widened with understanding, and he made a zipping motion across his lips, their shared sign for keeping a secret. Even in this tense moment, Mrs. Chen couldn't help but smile at his determination. She moved away from the windows and dialed the non-emergency police number she had saved in her contacts. Speaking in hushed tones, she asked specifically for Officer Kumar, explaining that she had sensitive information about suspicious activities in the neighborhood. To her relief, he was on duty and agreed to stop by the house within the hour, dressed in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. While they waited, Mrs. Chen helped the boy organize his drawings chronologically, creating a clear timeline of everything he had observed. She was amazed at how methodically he had documented the suspicious activities, dates, times, different vehicles, and various visitors, all captured through the eyes of a child who couldn't speak but saw everything. The boy suddenly stiffened, making rapid gestures toward the window. Mrs. Chen peeked out carefully and saw why. Another unmarked van had pulled up to the neighbor's house. This time, though, they weren't just carrying in equipment. Through the gap in the curtains, they could see people hurriedly moving things out, as if they were packing up to leave. The boy's hands flew in excited gestures. This wasn't part of their usual pattern. Mrs. Chen felt her heart rate quicken. Had the neighbors somehow realized they were being watched? She needed to update Officer Kumar immediately. As she reached for her phone, the boy tugged urgently at her sleeve once more. Looking out, they saw the neighbor's garage door beginning to open. Whatever was happening, it was clear that time was running out. Mrs. Chen quickly texted Officer Kumar, "They're moving out equipment now. Something's changed." Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed, but years of experience handling challenging situations helped her maintain her composure. The boy remained beside her, his small hand clutching the hem of her sweater, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding next door. Through the kitchen window, they watched as two men carried large boxes to the unmarked van, while another person kept glancing up and down the street. The boy tugged at Mrs. Chen's sweater and pointed to his earlier drawings, then back to the window. These weren't the same people who usually visited the house. Their movements were more hurried, less organized. Mrs. Chen's phone vibrated silently, a response from Officer Kumar, 5 minutes away. "Keep watching but stay inside. Backup is coming." She showed the message to the boy, who nodded solemnly. He understood the importance of remaining quiet and hidden, even more than usual. His keen eyes caught every detail as the activity next door grew more frantic. The neighbor's garage was now fully open, revealing stacks of boxes and equipment that had been hidden behind the usually closed door. Mrs. Chen wished she could somehow document what they were seeing without risking detection. As if reading her mind, the boy quickly grabbed his drawing pad and began sketching the scene with remarkable speed and accuracy, the van's position, the number of people, the boxes being loaded. Suddenly, the boy's hand froze mid-sketch. His eyes widened, and he pointed urgently toward the neighbor's driveway. One of the boxes had slipped, spilling its contents across the concrete. Even from their vantage point, they could see dozens of credit cards scattering like playing cards in the wind. The men scrambled to gather them up, their previous caution forgotten in their panic. Mrs. Chen's heart pounded as she sent another quick text to Officer Kumar, describing what they'd just witnessed. The response was immediate, "Almost there. Cars are approaching from both ends of the street. Stay where you are." She wrapped her arm protectively around the boy's shoulders as they continued their careful observation. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. The boy noticed it first, the subtle shift in the atmosphere as unmarked police cars quietly rolled into position at both ends of the street. His hand gestured rapidly, pointing out details Mrs. Chen might have missed: plainclothed officers taking positions behind trees and nearby parked cars, Officer Kumar's familiar figure approaching on foot from the direction of the park, looking like any other neighbor out for an afternoon walk. The men at the van remained oblivious, too focused on their hasty packing to notice the net slowly closing around them. Mrs. Chen and the boy watched as one of them emerged from the house with what appeared to be a laptop and several hard drives, heading for the van's driver's seat. It was clear they were planning to flee, but they had no idea it was already too late. The boy's grip on Mrs. Chen's sweater tightened as Officer Kumar gave a subtle hand signal. In an instant, the quiet afternoon erupted into coordinated action. Police officers emerged from their positions, moving with swift precision. Through the window, Mrs. Chen and the boy witnessed the culmination of weeks of the child's careful observation and documentation. The look of pure relief on the boy's face spoke volumes. His shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks, and he turned to Mrs. Chen with a small, triumphant smile. Without words, he had managed to expose a criminal operation that might have otherwise gone unnoticed for months. But their part in this drama wasn't quite over. Officer Kumar would need their help to understand exactly what the boy had witnessed over these past weeks. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Officer Kumar had come to the house once the situation was secure, gently asking if they would be willing to help the investigation team understand what they had witnessed. The boy sat at his familiar drawing table, now surrounded by two plainclothes detectives who watched in amazement as he methodically shared his carefully documented observations. Mrs. Chen stayed close to the boy, translating his unique gestures and helping explain his detailed drawings. The detectives were particularly impressed by his memory for dates and times, all carefully noted through simple but effective drawings of clocks and calendars. What might have seemed like a child's random doodles to others were actually a meticulous record of criminal activity. "This is remarkable," the female detective said softly, examining a drawing that showed the exact pattern of late-night visitors. "He's captured details that even our surveillance team might have missed." The boy beamed at the praise, his hands moving excitedly as he showed more of his drawings. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but feel proud. His inability to speak had led him to develop such acute observational skills that he'd become an exceptional witness. Outside, the street had transformed into a busy crime scene. Through the living room window, they could see officers carrying out boxes of evidence from the neighbor's house. The boy's parents had been contacted and were on their way home from the hospital. Mrs. Chen had spoken briefly with them on the phone, assuring them that their son was safe and had actually helped the police in an important way. As they waited for his parents, Officer Kumar shared what they could about the case. The neighbors had been part of a sophisticated credit card fraud ring, using stolen card information to create counterfeit cards. The boys' detailed documentation of their activities would be crucial evidence in building the case against them. His drawings had captured patterns and connections that might have taken investigators weeks to piece together. The boy listened intently as Officer Kumar explained how his observations would help prevent more people from becoming victims of fraud. Though he couldn't speak, his expressions showed he understood the significance of what he had done. Mrs. Chen watched as he added one final drawing to his collection, a simple but touching scene of police officers helping people, with a bright sun shining overhead. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway announced the arrival of the boy's parents. They rushed in, worry evident on their faces despite Mrs. Chen's reassurances. The moment they saw their son, safe and actually smiling, their tension visibly eased. The boy immediately began showing them his drawings, his hands flying in excited gestures as Mrs. Chen and Officer Kumar helped explain the extraordinary events of the day. His mother's eyes filled with tears as she realized how her silent, observant child had helped uncover a serious crime. His father stood proudly, one hand resting on his son's shoulder, as the detectives explained how valuable his detailed documentation had been to their investigation. The boy who had never spoken a word had found a powerful way to communicate truth and justice. As the evening settled in, the activity on the street began to wind down. The neighbors had been taken into custody, their equipment and evidence secured. Mrs. Chen watched as the boy stood at the window with his parents, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. He turned to her with a bright smile, making the gesture they used for "thank you," a simple movement that carried so much meaning. In the days that followed, their quiet suburban street gradually returned to normal, though something fundamental had changed in their household. The boy's parents began to see their son's silence in a new light, not as a limitation, but as a gift that had allowed him to develop extraordinary observational abilities. They spent more time trying to learn his unique sign language, often turning to Mrs. Chen for guidance in understanding his complex system of communication. The local police department wanted to recognize the boy's contribution to solving the case. Officer Kumar suggested a small, private ceremony at their home rather than a public event, understanding that too much attention might overwhelm the young hero. On a sunny Saturday morning, the police chief visited their house, bringing with her a special certificate of recognition and, to the boy's delight, a real junior detective badge. Mrs. Chen watched proudly as the boy received his badge, his eyes shining with joy. He immediately began showing the police chief his latest drawings, no longer of suspicious activities, but of everyday life in the neighborhood, children playing, birds nesting in trees, and families walking their dogs. His artistic skills, honed through months of careful observation, now captured the simple beauty of their community. The case had attracted some media attention, but the boy's parents and the police department worked together to protect his privacy. Instead of focusing on their son, the news stories emphasized how community awareness and cooperation with law enforcement could help prevent crime. The boy seemed content with this arrangement, more interested in his daily activities with Mrs. Chen than any public recognition. His parents noticed other positive changes too. The boy had begun teaching his sign language to his classmates at school, aided by his ever-present drawing pad. His art teacher was amazed by his progress, noting how his sketches showed remarkable attention to detail and emotion. What had once been seen as a communication barrier was transforming into a bridge, connecting him with others in unique and meaningful ways. Mrs. Chen introduced him to new art supplies, watercolors, pastels, and colored pencils, watching as he explored different ways to express himself. His drawings became more sophisticated, telling complex stories without a single word. She helped him create a special art corner in his room, complete with a small desk where he could observe the backyard through his window, though now his observations were of squirrels gathering acorns and butterflies visiting flowers. The experience had also strengthened the bond between the boy and his parents. His father installed a whiteboard in the kitchen where the family could practice their growing sign language vocabulary together during meals. His mother started a journal documenting their journey, filling it with his drawings and their shared experiences. The house that had once been filled with concern about their son's silence now buzzed with alternative forms of communication. One afternoon, while helping Mrs. Chen water the garden, the boy made a series of excited gestures toward the empty house next door. A "for sale" sign had just been posted, and a young family was touring the property. The boy quickly grabbed his drawing pad, but this time his sketch showed something hopeful: children playing in the neighboring yard, with bright flowers and friendly faces filling the page. Mrs. Chen smiled at his drawing, understanding its deeper meaning. The boy wasn't just showing what he hoped would happen, he was demonstrating his resilience and ability to look forward with optimism. Despite his experience with the former neighbors, he remained open to new possibilities and connections. His silence had never prevented him from engaging with the world, it had simply led him to find his own unique way of being heard. As summer turned to autumn, the neighborhood underwent subtle but significant changes. The new family that moved in next door brought with them 2 children close to the boy's age. Initially shy about meeting new neighbors after everything that had happened, he watched them from his window, making careful sketches of their moving-in day. Mrs. Chen noticed how his drawings of the new neighbors were filled with bright colors and hopeful details, a stark contrast to the dark, worried sketches of months past. The local community had also been transformed by the events. Parents began organizing neighborhood watch groups, not out of fear, but with a new understanding of how observant eyes could protect their community. Officer Kumar made regular visits, not for investigations now, but to help educate families about safety and awareness. During these meetings, he often used the boy's story, without naming him, as an example of how everyone, regardless of their abilities, could contribute to community safety. At school, the boy's art teacher had worked with him to develop a unique project. Using his drawings and Mrs. Chen's help with interpretation, they created a visual storytelling workshop where students could learn to communicate through art. Children who struggled with traditional writing found freedom in expressing themselves through pictures, and the boy discovered a new role as a mentor to others. Mrs. Chen watched with pride as her young charge flourished in unexpected ways. His drawings became more sophisticated, incorporating elements of storytelling that went beyond simple observation. He started creating small comic books about everyday heroes, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in their community. His parents had them bound into proper books, which found their way to the school library, inspiring other children to tell their own stories. The boy's father had taken a step further in supporting his son's development. He enrolled in a proper sign language course and began teaching what he learned to his colleagues at the hospital. This sparked an initiative to better serve nonverbal patients, with the boy's father often sharing how his own son had taught him the importance of alternative communication methods. One particularly meaningful moment came when the boy's mother discovered a series of drawings he had made about Mrs. Chen. Through detailed sketches, he had captured countless small moments of their time together, her patient hands guiding his while planting flowers, her encouraging smile when he mastered a new sign, the way she would sit quietly with him during afternoon observations of their now peaceful neighborhood. The drawings revealed not just his artistic skill, but the deep bond that had formed between them. The local police department had started a new program, inspired by the boy's experience, that encouraged children to be community helpers through art and observation. They created a safe way for young people to share concerns about their neighborhood, using drawings and other creative expressions. Officer Kumar often mentioned how this approach had already helped several families feel more connected and secure in their community. As Mrs. Chen helped the boy organize his growing collection of artwork one afternoon, they came across his old drawings of the suspicious neighbors. Instead of hiding them away, they decided to create a special album that told the complete story of how his unique abilities had helped make their community safer. The album became a powerful reminder that sometimes the quietest voices could have the most significant impact. His parents noticed that while he remained nonverbal, his confidence in expressing himself had grown tremendously. Through a combination of art, gesture, and his expanding sign language vocabulary, he had developed a rich and nuanced way of sharing his thoughts and feelings with the world. What once had seemed like a barrier had become a bridge to deeper connections with those around him. Winter arrived, bringing with it an unexpected surprise. The local art museum had heard about the boy's story through Officer Kumar's community outreach programs, and they were organizing a special exhibition called Silent Voices, featuring artwork by children who communicated in unique ways. They asked if some of the boy's drawings could be included, particularly those that showed how he had observed and documented the world around him. After careful consideration and discussions with Mrs. Chen, the boy decided to share selected pieces of his work. He chose drawings that told stories of community, hope, and the power of observation, careful to exclude any that might compromise the ongoing legal case. His parents watched in amazement as he meticulously curated his collection, showing an understanding of narrative and emotional impact that seemed well beyond his years. The preparation for the exhibition brought new experiences into their lives. Museum curators visited their home, and through Mrs. Chen's interpretation, learned the stories behind each drawing. The boy's face lit up as they treated his artwork with professional respect, carefully handling each piece and asking thoughtful questions about his creative process. His recent drawings showed the museum preparations, capturing the excitement and nervous energy in their household. Mrs. Chen had noticed another significant change in the boy's artwork. His newer pieces often included sound waves and musical notes, his way of showing that silence didn't mean an absence of rhythm or melody in life. He had started attending music classes at school, feeling the vibrations of instruments and expressing what he heard through his art. His music teacher was fascinated by how he visualized sound, creating a unique bridge between the auditory and visual worlds. The boy's relationship with the new neighbors had blossomed in unexpected ways. Their children, initially curious about his different way of communicating, had become eager students of his sign language. They would often sit together in the backyard, where he taught them to observe and sketch the world around them. Mrs. Chen would watch from the kitchen window as they created their own picture stories, their laughter and gestures forming a language of friendship that needed no words. One snowy afternoon, while helping Mrs. Chen prepare hot chocolate for his art club friends, a new after-school gathering he had inspired, the boy made a series of excited gestures. Through their now fluent form of communication, he expressed his wish to create a special series of drawings. He wanted to show how his experience had changed not just his life, but the lives of others in the community. The project he envisioned would tell multiple stories: the elderly neighbor who had learned to communicate with her nonverbal grandson after being inspired by the boy's story, the classroom where students now routinely used art to express difficult feelings, the police station's new youth outreach program that emphasized observation and creative expression. Mrs. Chen helped him organize these ideas, watching as he mapped out each story with the same careful attention to detail that had once helped solve a crime. His parents had also undergone their own transformation. His father, once focused solely on verbal communication therapies, now advocated for multiple forms of expression in his medical practice. His mother had started a support group for parents of nonverbal children, sharing their family's journey of discovering the strength in different ways of communicating. Their home had become a hub for families learning to embrace alternative forms of expression. As Mrs. Chen helped the boy pin up his latest series of drawings in his room, she reflected on how far they had come. The quiet, watchful child who had first shown her his worried observations of suspicious neighbors had blossomed into a confident young artist who used his unique perspective to bring positive change to his community. His silence had never been emptiness, it had been a space filled with careful observation, deep understanding, and the ability to touch others' lives in profound ways. 1 year had passed since the day the boy first shared his urgent observations with Mrs. Chen. The opening night of the Silent Voices exhibition at the local art museum had arrived, transformed into a community celebration of creativity and connection. The boy's artwork, displayed alongside pieces from other children who communicated in unique ways, drew visitors into a world where words weren't necessary to tell powerful stories. Officer Kumar attended the opening, not in his police uniform but as a proud friend of the family. He watched as the boy guided small groups through the exhibition, using gestures and drawings to explain the stories behind each piece. The officer couldn't help but smile, remembering the shy child who had helped solve a significant case through his careful observations and artistic documentation. The exhibition had a special section dedicated to community heroes, featuring artwork from children across the city. The boy's influence had sparked a movement of young people using art to express their concerns and hopes for their neighborhoods. Mrs. Chen stood nearby, her eyes misting as she watched children pointing excitedly at various drawings, their parents engaged in thoughtful discussions about the power of observation and creative expression. During the exhibition, the boy unveiled a new series of drawings that told the story of his journey over the past year. The first pieces showed dark, worried scenes of suspicious neighbors, but as visitors moved through the series, they saw the artwork transform into bright, hopeful images of community connection and understanding. The final piece was a large drawing of his neighborhood, filled with people communicating in various ways, through sign language, art, music, and gesture. His parents had arranged for a sign language interpreter to be present at the exhibition, making it accessible to the deaf community. The boy was fascinated by the interpreter's fluid movements, adding to his growing vocabulary of expression. He had begun incorporating elements of formal sign language into his own unique system, creating a rich blend of communication methods that bridged multiple worlds. The success of the exhibition led to an unexpected development. The local school board, impressed by how the boy's story had inspired others, decided to implement an arts-based communication program across all elementary schools in the district. Mrs. Chen was asked to consult on the program, sharing her experience of how art could give voice to those who communicated differently. As the evening drew to a close, the boy tugged gently at Mrs. Chen's sleeve, leading her to a quiet corner of the gallery. There, he unveiled one final drawing he had kept secret, a portrait of her, surrounded by all the children she had helped find their voice through art. The detail was extraordinary, capturing not just her appearance but the essence of her patient, understanding nature. Around the portrait, he had drawn small scenes of their time together, each one representing a moment where her belief in him had helped him grow stronger. Mrs. Chen hugged the boy tightly, no words or signs needed to express their shared journey. From their first afternoon together, through the tense days of observing criminal activity, to this moment of triumph, their bond had grown into something extraordinary. The boy who couldn't speak had taught an entire community to listen with their hearts and see with new eyes. As they walked together through the gallery one last time that evening, Mrs. Chen noticed how the boy carried himself with quiet confidence. His silence was no longer something to be overcome but a gift that had allowed him to develop extraordinary abilities. Through his art and actions, he had shown that sometimes the most powerful voices are those that speak without words. The exhibition would travel to other cities, spreading its message of inclusive communication and community awareness. But for the boy, his family, and Mrs. Chen, its greatest success was already evident in their transformed neighborhood, where differences were celebrated, creativity flourished, and every form of expression was valued as a unique and precious gift.